Welcome back to this video on React, Redux and TypeScript. This is the second installment in the React, Redux, TypeScript video series, and in particular this video will focus on the Redux Thunk configuration. So we've already seen how we can lay out our folder structures using React, Redux and TypeScript. Now we're going to add the ability to perform asynchronous operations using the Redux architecture. So what I'll do to start off with is I'll just create a React app with the TypeScript template with the npx create React app Redux Thunk --template TypeScript command. And while that's loading, I'll just take a look at the folder structure that we'll be dealing with. And this is similar to the previous video's folder structure. So we're going to have our index, and that's going to contain our app component, and we will wrap that in the store, so the store is available to the entire application. And we're going to keep the app component quite lean, and we're going to assign the UI to a main page component, and this will have the all of the UI elements, although in our case we'll just simply lay out the structure for that. And then of course we can have our store, and within our store we have a root store which sets up our store. We're going to have a models folder for the interfaces for the entire application, and in particular the actions of the entire application. And then we're just going to have a simple to do which will focus on the Redux Thunk asynchronous structure here, which is exactly the same structure as the previous Redux video's structure. You have the action and the reducer and the actions model for that action, and of course the to-do model. So now that's loaded, let's just cd into our Redux Thunk folder here. And actually I probably should have named this Redux Thunk -TypeScript, just because when we install the dependency it may complain that we have the same name. So I'm just going to change that to Redux Thunk TS in the package JSON. And we can see our dependencies here anyway, so since we got this file open, may as well see that. And we can just do the npm install Redux, React Redux and Redux Thunk dependencies here using Node Package Manager. And the only addition in this video compared to the last video is this Redux Thunk, and that will let us perform the asynchronous actions. So we can install some dev dependencies here. We can just get the Redux logger for a nice logging in our console of the actions and the states that it's in, and then we can just get some types relating to the React Redux and Redux logger packages for our type safety. So I can just install those, and if I open up the package JSON file, we can see as our core dependencies we have Redux, Redux Thunk, TypeScript, React Redux, and then all of the other stuff relating to create React app and TypeScript template. And if we go to our dev dependencies, we have those types for the Redux logger and React Redux. So now that we have our folder structure in mind and we have our dependencies and our application set up, we can just go ahead and remove some of the boilerplate. So we can remove this app.css file, we can remove this test file here, we can remove this logo SVG, and we could probably remove some other things, but that's enough. And just allow that for the ESLint. And what we can do here is we can just remove the reference to logo and the CSS file, and we can just simply return a div, an empty div here. And what I might do is I might actually make this a functional component. So I'll just make this const app which is of the type React functional component, which is the sort of ES6 arrow syntax sort of function. And rather than return a div here, what I'll do is we'll wrap our application to return the main page, so that's can be handled nicely there. So we'll have this main page, and of course we need to create this component. So in the source folder we can create a file, and we can say components and /main page.tsx. So we create a file, it's just a shortcut, which when you have the slash it just creates that nicely for us. So I'm just going to make this a class-based component. So using the React snippets extension, I can just say RCC and click on tab here. Now there would need to be a few adjustments, but it gives us a nice boilerplate here. And I'm just going to say main page here, just for now. So when we render that, we can just simply import that from the components file, and it's currently a default export, but we will make this, we will keep it as a default export, so that's okay. So that means we can just import it directly like this, and that's going to come from the components and the main page within the components. So if I save this and I run an npm start, we should just get a very simple main page text. So we'll let that compile, and then yes, we get our main page text. And I'll just press F12 to open our developer tools. And it should be noted what we will be getting is we'll be using JSON placeholder for our synchronous request. We're just going to do a GET request and get all this information. Although this structure and outline of React and Redux Thunk will give you the tools to be able to grow your application and do any of the asynchronous operations. So, okay, so we've got our main page set up. We need to create our store so we can wrap our application in the store. So let's just create a few files here, and we have our summary here, and we can see that we're going to have a store folder, and that's going to have a root store file in it. So we can just say in the source folder we can create a new file, and we can create the store /root store, which is where we'll configure our store. And that just created the folder and file for us. Of course, we will need to come back to this root store because we need the actions and reducers set up for our to-dos. But we can just simply also have a file within this store here for the models, and there's an actions file within that model. So that's the global applications of our entire store. We're just going to have one, but this would just sort of outlines the structure for if you were to grow your application using Redux Thunk. So in our store here, this is where we can have a models folder, and we can have the actions in here, and of course we're going to need to come back to this one as well. So I'll just close those two for now, and the package JSON as well. So in our store we've got models and actions, and then we've got our root store. Now we just need to have our to do. So I'm going to create a folder here in store called to do, and I'll just create a to do action.typescript file, and I'll also create a to do reducer.typescript file, and there's also going to be a models for the to-dos. So within that to-dos folder I can just create a new folder for the models there, and then of course we're going to have our to-do interface, and we're going to have our standard to-do actions, so actions.ts. So let's just start off, and we'll just start off by creating our interfaces and models for our to-dos. So for our to-do, we can export the interface to-do with a capital T, and if we look at JSON placeholder here, we can see that we get a user ID, an ID, a title, and a boolean if it's completed or not. So we can just pretty much copy these values here and use this as a starting point. Of course, we're going to have these quotes here, so I'll just do a Control D and get rid of these. And of course, I need to change this to the type that it is. So the user ID is a number, the ID is also a number, the title is going to be a string, and this completed is going to be a boolean. And I believe these should also be semicolons, and this is a string. So we have our to-do interface ready. Now we can start to create our actions interface. So I'll close that to-do interface, and in the actions I'll actually import that to-do that we just exported, and that's from within the same file, within the same folder. Now the difference between Redux and Redux Thunk in terms of defining the TypeScript and performing the actions is that in the synchronous actions there's only one sort of action that can occur, but in the asynchronous there's 3 different states that the particular action could be in. So you can request the information, and then it can either come back as a success or a failure. So we need to handle and define both of those cases, and we start off by creating our types, and this could be in its own file as well, if the application grows even larger and you need it in multiple files for whatever reason, but this is going to be quite self-contained in this example. So I'm just going to create this constant variable of the type of action, and I'm going to use the fetch underscore to-dos underscore request, all up in capital letters there, and of course the type is going to correspond to that. And we can do the same thing, and we do this for fetching the to-dos. So if there's a success here, so I can do success, and likewise I can do the failure. Now what I might do here is, because the interface for the to-dos request, success and failure, they're all going to be the same sort of structure, is I might create a base structure so I can extend that and put a different type on the particular action that we're required here. So I'm just going to start off with having this interface, and you can call it whatever you like to-do base. I might just call it to-do base. I might call it to-do async, just to confirm that it's an asynchronous option. And okay, so what states are we going to have here? Obviously we're going to want our to-dos, but before we get our to-dos, we need to make sure that they're loaded. So we just need to have some sort of Boolean response here to signify whether or not the to-dos are loaded or loading or failed. And of course we're going to need our to-dos, and that's going to be of the type to-do array, so an array of the to-dos. And there can also be an error, so we can just output a string error here. And I'm going to extend this to-do base, and I'm just going to say for the interface, fetch to-dos request, this is going to extend the to-do async interface, and we can give it a custom type. So it's going to have all of this sort of structure here, but so has it loading, to-dos, error, but it also is going to have a unique type, which is just going to be the type of the fetch to-dos request. And I can copy this 2 more times, and rather than fetch to-dos request, I can have fetch to-dos success, and I can copy the type there, and I'll just preempt this by changing that to type failure, and I can rename this particular interface fetch to-dos failure with a R. So now that we have our actions interfaces set up, we can just go ahead and export that as a type. So we have our to-do actions action type, and we do this so we can, in the reducer, it could be any one of those cases, so we need to return that particular case. So we can just say it's either going to be a request, which will result in either a success or a failure. So we can have that like that, and that pretty much wraps up our interfaces for our actions. So now we can actually create our actions, and I might start off by just importing a few things. I'm going to need to import dispatch, which is just to have the dispatch type from Redux. And I also want our app actions. So to have our app actions, we need to actually define our global actions. And since we now have our actions in our interfaces set up, we can go ahead and do that. So I think I just closed that, so I'll just reopen that. But in our models in to-do, we had particular actions here, and then we exported the to-do action type. So, and I might actually call this like plural types, because there's multiple types here. So that means in our models, in our global models, we can actually import that. So we can import the to-do action types, and that's going to come in from, and we just need to go back a directory out of models into the to-do folder and go into those models and get those model actions, and we can then export a type here of app actions, and this is just going to be equal to the to-do action types. And of course, once the application grows and there's more action types, you can just chuck on another action type here, and that's how you can extend the application. But we just need this to-do action types as our app actions. So that means when we come to our to-do actions, we can actually import the app actions as a type, because we want to specify with TypeScript that what we're returning, and tick type safety across our application. So we can get those in from models actions, and of course we need to import the different types that we just created from the models actions relative to to-dos. So in particular these ones, the fetch to-dos request, fetch to-dos success, and finally the fetch to-dos failure. And these are just coming from the same area in the local to-dos models and those particular actions. We'll also want the to-do model from models as well, but in the to-do file there. Okay, so we're going to start off by creating a request to-dos function, and we can export that. So we can export the, actually I don't think we need to export it yet, because what we're going to do is we're going to bound that particular request, and this will become clear when we create it. So we'll create a function here called request to dos, and this is going to return something of the type app actions, and we can use this sort of parentheses around our object to return the object directly. And we know that this is going to have the type fetch to dos request. So we're just filling out the structure of our interfaces here. We're going to have our loading, and while we're requesting it, it's loading, so we can set that equal to true. While it's loading, however, the to-dos is going to be an empty array, and the error, well, that isn't an error yet because it's still loading and haven't received a termination of a success or failure. So, okay, so you can return that. And very similarly, we can copy this for receiving the to-dos. So we can call this receive to-dos, which means there was a success, so the type is success, and it will be no longer loading, so that can be set to false. This is going to need to take in some to-dos, and we're going to see where we get this value from soon, but it will actually take this to-do, and we're going to need to do something special to be able to actually get it in this format, but we will actually get the to-dos, and that means that there was no error. And then I can actually just copy this again, and for the final case we can have something called invalidate to-dos, which will be of the type fetch to-dos failure, and loading will be set to false. The to-dos will be an empty array, but in the case of an error we can specify an error message, and we can just say unable to fetch the to-do list. So these are our base functions, but we need to create and export something that's known as a bound function, and that sort of helps us to be able to receive this to-dos value, because obviously we haven't got the to-dos yet because we need to make the request before receiving the to-dos, and then once you receive the to-dos, then you can plug it into this function here. So we can export a constant function, and we can just call it bound request to-dos equals, and what we'll do here is we need to return a function, a dispatch function, which is specified using dispatch, which is of the type dispatch of our particular app actions. And then we need to actually call the dispatch method, so dispatch, on the particular method that we want to dispatch. So obviously we want to dispatch this request to dos function when this is called, and this is going to be called elsewhere in the application, so we need to bind it, so that's why I call it bound request to dos. This allows us to access these Redux Thunk actions and trigger them elsewhere in our components. So we need to dispatch that, and we're returning a dispatch function. So when it's been dispatched, what we can do is we can actually return something else here, and this is going to be our fetch request to JSON placeholder. So I'm going to copy this URL here, and it's just the to-dos with the query limiting it to 5. So I can just call the fetch API, and I'm going to use backticks here, although it doesn't really matter because it's just going to be the URL. But you know, for edits and stuff like that, you want the backticks, and use the template literal to specify which number you're on. And then with the response, what I can do here is say, okay, the response.json, to convert it into JSON format, which is a promise itself. So we're going to need to do another then, and with that JSON that we've received, the JSON of the to-dos, we can go ahead and dispatch our action receive to-dos, and we can receive the to-dos. So we make the request, we get our to-dos in the JSON format, and then with that to-dos in JSON format, we receive those JSON formatted to-dos. That's where this variable comes in handy. So we can populate our to-dos array with that to-dos JSON that's been coming from JSON placeholder. So now that we have our action set up, we can create our to-do reducer. So we need to import those action types once again, and I might actually just copy these here. So I can import these fetch to do requests, but I'm also going to need the actual to do action itself, because I could be returning any one of these types here in our reducer. And of course I'll need the to do model. So what I might do here is I might just create an interface, and I'm just going to call this to do state, which will represent a interface for the state of the to do state, which is just going to be the loading, the boolean, the to dos of a to do array type, and the error, which will be of the string type. And of course, because we're making a reducer, we need a default state, and I define that model so I could call it that to do state default state. And the default state will be, well, nothing's happened, so the loading is false, the to dos is an empty array, and the error will be nothing because nothing's happened. Okay, so this is where we can actually create our reducer here. So we can export as a constant variable the to do reducer, and we can take in the state, which is going to be equal to the default state, and a particular action. So that particular action is going to be of the to do action types, and I just need to return something of the to do state, which is done by using a switch statement here. And I'm just getting an error here because I need to specify the returns. So what I'll do is, in our switch statement for our pure function or our reducer, we're going to type in the action type, so whatever it is it a request, is it a success, is it a failure? And I'm going to assign a different case here, and for the case that it is the fetch to do's request, what we can do in that case is we can just simply return some sort of object here of this sort of format, saying that loading is actually true, but the to do's is, well, we haven't received them yet, and that should be to do's. And of course there's no error. So that's the first case here. Now, okay, so we're going to have two more cases here. Okay, sorry, that's within the switch statement. And we're going to have the success case and the failure case. Now, in the success and failure cases, these are going to be no longer loading. The to-dos error, the to-dos for the failure will be empty, but the error is going to relate to the action.error, which we just set unable to fetch to-dos list. So, and of course we need to handle the success case, so we can just simply say whatever the action to-dos we receive in this reducer, that's what we can give to the to-do success case. And finally, we need a return statement here. So I'm just going to have a default case here in case, you know, it's no longer requested or anything like that. And that's just going to be our initial state, or whatever the state is. So we have our action set up and we have our reducers set up. So we can actually go back to the root store and sort of create our root store now. So let's just do that. And okay, so how can we do that? We're going to need a few imports here. The first import we're going to need is create store, combine reducers. Even though we only have one, we're building this to grow and we want to be able to handle that ability to grow. So from Redux, we're going to need Thunk and something known as Thunk middleware, and that's coming from Redux Thunk. And then we're going to need to import the create logger from Redux logger. And of course we're going to need our reducer, so we need to import the to-do reducer that we just created, and that's going to come from the to-do folder and the to-do reducer. And finally we're going to need to import our app actions, and that's coming from the models folder, the global actions. So similar to how we've only got one action and one reducer, this is just the structure so we can grow. So with the same structure you can easily add a whole new section, like let's say you have another asynchronous or synchronous thing in the store like to do, you can just simply create this same structure here, import it and add it as necessary, and that is the entire structure for the application. So okay, so we have the app actions. So okay, we can just sort of create our logger with create logger. And if this is going too fast through this video, I really encourage you to watch the previous video because it really steps through the React Redux architecture and the middleware and all the concepts behind this. So what we can do is we can actually export a constant variable, root reducer, and this is going to call the combine reducers, which itself just takes a comma separated list of the reducers that we want to include. We have to do reducer in this case, and we also want to export the application state type. because we're going to need that when we create our store and use it. And this has a particular return type, and it's going to be the type of the root reducer. So everything in the root reducer can be, the shape of it can be accessible. So that is our entire application state, and we're going to need that TypeScript definition of app state when we use it. So finally, what we can do here is we can actually just go ahead and create our store, and we can use the create store method, and this is going to take in our application state and our app actions as the first parameter here. It's also going to take two others, and this is just sort of instantiating or initializing them as empty objects. So nothing really to be concerned about there, unless you're doing some hardcore customization sort of stuff. But what I can do here is I can have our root reducer in here, and then we need to actually apply our middleware. So we can apply our middleware, and we've imported Thunk, so let's use Thunk as, and this is where we use the Thunk middleware type, which is our application state and our app actions as types. So it's very important that we use and import Thunk before logger. So logger should be last, because we need to go through all of the middleware before we log it out. And recall that the middleware is in between the actions and the reducer, so it does something after an action's called and intercepts that, and then does something. So in this case, we're intercepting the fact that we're dealing with asynchronous requests. Otherwise, it wouldn't, the action wouldn't be notified that it's asynchronous request. It will go straight in the reducer and nothing will happen, because it will just execute line by line and it won't wait for anything to happen. So this middleware is doing something in between that action, and we want to wait for that to happen before we log it out. So we put this logger as the last parameter here, and this is actually outside. This is a different middleware, so the comma separation needs to be there. So we have something like this for our root store. Okay, so we have our root store, that's great. Now we need to use it. So in our index file, we can import two things. We can import the provider functionality from, or the wrapper from React Redux, and we can also import the store from store/root store. Now we can use this provider wrapper to wrap our application in with the provider tag, and we can actually put app inside that. And this provider, it takes a store, and that will be the store that we just created. So our entire application state in the form of our reducers and the connections through the dispatching of actions. So we've got our index set up here. So if we open up our app file, we pretty much, we don't really want to touch the app file itself, because we've designated all of everything to happen to this main page. So really we want to open up the main page now. So let's open that up. Where is that? In the components here, main page. And this is where we're going to set up everything. So one thing we need to do is So to connect our store to the main page and provide everything to our entire application, we need to connect to it. And to connect to it, React Redux provides us with this connect function here. From React Redux. So we can actually, this is actually a higher order function. So what I will do is I'll take this export default off here, because I can actually export default the main page, but I need to connect. And this connect function is going to take something known as map state to props and map dispatch to props. And what these are essentially, well, it's making everything into a prop. So the state of our application and the actions, so we can use those. And this actually returns our main page component in a function. So a little strange, but we'll go back and we'll actually create these. And then hopefully that makes a little more sense. So, okay, we're gonna need a few things here. So okay, so we're going to need something from React Redux. Okay, so we got connect from React Redux. We're going to need something from Redux called bind action creators. And just bear with me, there's a lot going on here. So just follow along and then it'll all come together. So this bind action creators, what this is doing is, recall that we made our bind action or our bound request to do's, and this is going to allow us to access this, dispatch this action from anywhere. So we need to bind it to the particular area that we're working on it with, and this is why we're starting to do this map state to props and map dispatch to props sort of stuff, so we can, we can get that action that we're dispatching from anywhere, and then we can map it to the main page, and then all of those dispatch and all those actions will be sort of accessible to the main page, and likewise with the global state. So we can import something known as Thunk dispatch, which is a asynchronous way to dispatch actions. And we can import that from Redux Thunk. Of course, we're going to need our entire application state, so we need to import that from the store, that one directory, and the root store. And we also need our app actions from the store as well, but in the models folder within the global actions. Then we need to import the interface for to do, so we can get that from the store, from to do, from models and the to do model. Okay, let's just say it's declared but never used. We'll use that. And of course, we're going to need our action, and our action is this asynchronous request for bound request to do's, which is going to dispatch another action here, and it's an asynchronous action, so we're using It's going to be of the type Thunk dispatch, but we're going to need that so we can access that. And that's going to come from the store, and it's going to come from to do and to do action. So, okay, so this is going to be an empty interface, and this just is here, not because it has to be here in this case, but just to demonstrate that if the app had its own properties, you would define them in here, and they'll be combined with what the overall state and dispatch properties are going to be used in this main page. So if this had any of its own props, you could chuck it in there, and you can also extend your own props if required. However, we don't have any of our own props, so we're just going to say interface link state props, and this is going to just be a model of the state of our application. And the state of our application that we need to link is just simply the to-dos. We just want access to the to-dos, and we're going to have another interface here called link dispatch props, and this is going to be the bound request to-dos function, and just the shape of that function is just, it doesn't take anything and just returns void, and most of these will just return void. And we can create a type with the, the props, the link state props and the link dispatch props. So I can create this type here called link props, and it's going to be props and link state props, and also the link dispatch props. So we have this separation, but then we join it together because in the map state to props, we need to, sorry, not in the map state to props, but in the component, the component needs to be aware of this, so we can just pass in here as a type of the component. It's referring to these link props. So we still need to create map state to props and map dispatch to props. So let's do that. And we got the tools we need now to create that. So let's start with map state to props. And this is going to take in the application state. So the state of the application, or the app state, and what it's going to return to us is something in the form of the link state props. So we're taking the application state and we're sort of linking that application state to properties, and the properties we want accessible within this consumption of the store is this to-dos array here. So we can just return the to-dos, and that's going to be on the state. And recall that the app state is nothing more than the root store, in particular the root reducer, and the root reducer contains all of the reducers, but in our case we just have the to-do reducer, and with reference to the to-do reducer, we're just returning the to-do. So that's all we really need to return here. But to return the to-dos, we need to access the to-do reducer, and on that root reducer, we have our error, we have our loading, but all we really want here is we want our to-dos. So we can just return that. So we have the map state to props hooked up. That gets rid of that error. So let's do a similar thing here for the map dispatch to props. And this takes in dispatch as a function, and this is of the type Thunk dispatch with reference to the application state, an empty object, and a app actions. And this is going to return us the object of the particular type of the dispatched action. So not the type, sorry, but the particular action that we're calling. And we already have this sort of bound request to do's here. So we can map that interface accordingly. And this is where we need this bind action creators function from Redux, and that just allows us to tap into the actions that are created outside of this area sort of thing, and we can bound request to do's. Okay, so we can just bind those, and what we do here is we just bind it to the particular action here, and that takes in as a second parameter dispatch. So this is relating to this bound request to do's, where we request the to do's, it dispatches an action or returns a function to dispatch that action. That function that returns to dispatch the action. This also induces this next return statement to call the API. We're mapping the dispatch props by importing that particular action, but because it's outside of this scope, we need to bind it using this bind action creators. And likewise, we have the application state, and we just have our to-dos here. And with these two functions here, we can see that we can now connect to our store, and our main page now has access to the entire state and all of the actions that have been specified. So we've pretty much done all the hard work now. All we need to really do is just use it. So let's do that. And okay, so to do that, I just want to actually, now that we've linked the state to the properties, that means this main page has this to-dos as a property, and likewise it has this bound request to-dos as a property, or as a prop, sorry. So we can actually just get that, and we can use some destructuring here, and we can get the to-dos by destructuring this .props. What? Okay, and okay, so we're getting an error because it's declared but never used. So let's use it. And what I might return here, okay, this needs to be in the render function for one thing. Okay, so, but what we need to return here is we need to return a bunch of things. So let's just keep everything in a div. And let's just sort of line this out a bit nicer. And we can just have like a header tag here, and we can just say to-do list. And what we can do is we can have a UL, and this UL needs to have a okay, and obviously this div needs to be at the end here. We need to loop through our list items that were received. So before I do that, we need to actually use a lifecycle method because we're in the class-based component system. So in the main page, I'm going to have this component didMount function, and this is what is going to fire when the component didMount. So the HTML has been rendered, and we can just say this .props .bound request to dos, because recall that we bound both the actions and our state to properties of this main page, so we can access this main page props and actually fire this bound request to dos that's been bound by using this bind action creators to link to the actions, and returns its own dispatch functionality or function, and then that gets connected to our store, and then this is accessible through this page. So we just want to do this when on the component didMount, so the the DOM's been painted essentially, and we can make the request, we can fire that off, and then we can populate our DOM with that data. So we can do that in a UL, and within that UL, this is where we can tab that in for one thing, but we can actually use some JSX here. So for the to-dos that we've destructured from this props, we can actually just map that, and we're going to map each of the to-do of the to-do type. So that should, what's going on here? Cannot find module store, to-do models, to-do, store, to-do. Okay, I'm just going to leave that for now and come back to that, because I really wanted to finish off this logic here. So this is going to be mapped to an li, and each li, I'm going to just say, okay, well, it's going to have the key of the to-do ID, which recall that in our to-do model, we have an ID, a title, and completed, along with the user ID being returned here. So to uniquely identify that particular list element, I can just do that with the key to do ID. I can then render in the li the title, and what I want to do is I just want to cross it out if it's completed and leave it open if it's not completed. So on the li, I'm going to have a style, and I can use the double curly braces here to indicate the object, CSS object here. So I'm just going to say, okay, we can have text decoration, and if the to-do is completed, we just use this ternary here, we can chuck a line through it. Otherwise, if it's not completed, we just have none here like that. So let's just save that. And we are still getting this error here. Okay, so, okay, so we just got to go back a directory, that's all it was, to the store. So if I save that, okay, we're getting this error, invalidate to-dos is assigned but never read, and that's true, we never handled that case, but this was more about the structure of the Redux Thunk, so I'm sure you're able to handle that. But if we look into our React application, okay, so what's happening here, we reload it and we fire an action, we request the to-dos, and that request to-dos is coming from the main page, and in particular when it's painted or the component's mounted, we call that. That fetches them, and it was a success because we get this action back. Now we're using Redux Thunk. We can have access to this asynchronous behavior here, and we get this success here. which has its own state associated with it. In particular, we're interested in to-dos, and we've just mapped those out as LIs in our list, and we've just have this one that's crossed out because if we look at our state, we can see that this one is actually completed here. So great, so we've figured out how to use Redux Thunk, and in the previous video we did regular Redux. So we now have the architecture needed to scale this application and manage our state efficiently. So just to sort of recap everything that we've done here in this video, we started by creating a store in our index file and wrapping and providing that store to our entire application, and the application or the app file just references this main page, and this main page, this is where we actually do the work of connecting to the store. And we've defined our root store. So we created our to-do actions, we created our to-do reducer to handle those particular actions, and recall that we had 3 different cases for an asynchronous request. So you request it, you either receive it, or you get an error. We've added the middleware into our store so we can handle the async and also log out things neatly in our console. And of course we've done the interfaces and models for everything for type safety, but now we had created our root reducer of the to-do reducer. We essentially implemented the functionality, so the ability to make the request and perform the asynchronous actions by connecting to the store with this higher order connect function, and we're mapping the entire application state and all its actions to properties of this. So we can, of course we have to define a few things here, such as the state and the actions that we have. So we want the to-do state and the ability to request to-dos. We made that all into its own type, and then we made the map state to props. So we took the application state and we just mapped that to the property. Likewise with the dispatch prop, we have this asynchronous Thunk dispatch function, which is a function that returns a function, and we bound that function for the bound request to do's that we imported here, and we can just fire that dispatch. So we're able to do that, and that means we have a way to sort of control the entire architecture and the entire properties and state of our application in a nice way. And everything from here is just using the same principles and extending it pretty much, and having extra sections and stuff like that. So you make the request by dispatching that action when the component mounted, and then that will get populated and rendered into the DOM, and as a result you get the information and you get this nice asynchronous to-do list. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I'll see you then.